Every year in sport and general aviation, loss of control events are the single most significant contributor to serious and fatal aircraft accidents.
If we're going to be distracted, then we're heading for trouble.
We were at 3,500 feet. If I hadn't applied the correct input, we would have entered a fully developed spin.
As we start to lose visual reference to the natural horizon, we start to lose our situational awareness as to what the aircraft is doing.
The plane went into about a 360-degree stall spin.
By the time I'd got it and the aircraft had become airborne in the 3-point attitude, I probably didn't even have time to think, oh shit.
And then they'll panic, and normally they add power as well, which just accentuates the problem. So there we go, we're into the spiral dive.
We lifted off, caught the fence, went into the ground, but could not do a thing about it.
He actually drifted to the right, but next thing, whack, and we hit something on our side.
In this three-part series, we explore the critical phases of flight where loss of control occur. We look at the primary causes, we look at contributing factors, and we talk to real pilots, subject matter experts, and we delve into the situations and how to avoid these types of accidents.
Power back straight away. You're not really sure of the stick position, and before you know it, during a low-level turn, you can stall the wing and turn into an incipient spin at low level.
Left rudder at departure.
If we can save just one life, it will be worth making this series.
Note the airspeed, note the height we lost. So now we're going to turn back.
We hope that this series will help create a safer flight environment for our pilots. In this final episode of our Loss of Control series, we explore the landing. So where does this start? It's often further back in the circuit than we think, but for clarity, we'll look at the final approach, we'll look at the flare and hold off, right through to coming to rest. Importantly, we'll also look at the missed approach and the decision making, often also known as the go-around. In episode 1, we looked at the dynamic changes that occur in the takeoff phase of flight. Likewise in landing, we have those similar challenges. Unfortunately, we see a lot of loss of control events in the landing phase of flight.
Consider that final is a critical phase of flight because you've got sometimes crosswind and turbulence to put up with, other traffic, radio calls, and all of those situations add to letting yourself be distracted from the primary job of controlling the aeroplane. That's the first thing. And the first thing you need for control in any case will always be speed. An aeroplane doesn't fly without speed. That's the most important thing it has. And if you keep the speed in the right parameters, then you're not going to have a problem with control. But there's this constant battle sometimes for your attention, and that's the thing that we need to consider mostly.
So how do we break down loss of controls in the landing phase of flight? Well, essentially it can be broken down into two areas. Still loss of control in flight. So when we're in the final phase of flight, the approach, we can actually either stall the aircraft, we can have at the beginning of an incipient spin or a wing drop, or we can get into another state where aerodynamically the aircraft's not right. But surprisingly, a lot of our actual loss of control in landing occurs in what we call runway excursions. So the aircraft has actually touched down at some point in the landing phase and directional control may not be maintained, the aircraft may be bounced back into the air, but basically the aircraft's actually already initially landed and we see subsequent loss of control from that point onwards. Look, once the aircraft's landed and touched down, we may have the aircraft set up with a balance of forces that once we put that nose wheel down on the ground, in this case, the aircraft is set up like a shopping trolley to go the wrong way. We need to use the appropriate control inputs, and if we are going to put the aircraft down with cross controls in any way, shape or form, we need to be able to correct that quickly. Clearly, when we're in the flare, we don't often see the yaw that's developing and we don't manage that effectively with rudder. It's really important, particularly with diminishing aileron control, that alignment of the centerline continues right through the landing, and we should hold that nose wheel off, in a nose wheel aircraft at least, for as long as we can, so that we actually still have control of the aircraft in the longitudinal sense. Clearly, once the aircraft's touched down, we've still got a lot of forces working on the aircraft that we still have to manage. Obviously, P forces, slipstream effect, are going to want to yaw that aircraft, and in most cases to the left. We often don't see this because we've got the nose above the horizon and somewhat obscured. But we have to know that these things are going to happen and be prepared for it. And in this case, obviously apply the right rudder input to maintain directional control right throughout the landing phase until we go again.
I've had partial engine failures and I've had full engine failures, but this was different because I felt like I didn't have control. A mate of mine came out to Roma. He's normally very good at everything he does. So I said, well, let's go down to a property, a farm strip about 14 nautical miles south of Roma. And of course it's narrower and it's only 800 metres long, it's not 1500 metres like Roma. When we came in, he actually drifted to the right, and I looked up the side of the runway and the owner of the strip had traffic cones along the side. And I looked and I thought, oh yeah, we're still safe. But next thing, whack, and we hit something on our side. So I hit the power, took over, and got it airborne. And when I got it airborne, I felt the controls. I thought, this doesn't feel real good. I think in hindsight, what I should have done is the moment the other pilot drifted off the centre line, I should have told him to go around, and we should have gone back and had another go. He just drifted too far to the right, and I looked out, thought it was okay, I didn't correct it. So I elected to go to Roma. I climbed to 2,000 AGL. As we came into land, I put some flap out. As soon as I put the flap out, the plane went nose down. So I got rid of the flap and we just landed flapless. Got back to the hangar, and that's where we discovered that the aircraft horizontal stabilator had actually hit one of the cones and it actually snapped the bolt. In hindsight, I think we're pretty lucky to get out of that one.
Just move it up and down like it is for the video. Okay, good.
If it would have been doing that, we would have heard it and you would have felt it through the air.
The first two landings he did, they were fine. It was just, he just drifted too far to the right. And I looked out, thought it was okay, I didn't correct it, which I should have.
In this example, we've seen a situation where a deviation in runway alignment was allowed to continue. So anytime we allow a sustained error in our approach, that we don't fix something early, it's inevitable that we're going to have to deal with probably a bigger consequence later on. Clearly in this story, we saw quite a significant consequence. We hit something on the ground. We should never let the aircraft get to that point. Small errors need to be fixed quickly, either in terms of airspeed, pitch, attitude, descent rate, or alignment. All those things are fundamental ingredients to a controlled and stabilised approach. Any one of those elements can have consequences if we don't fix them.
So I fly down final on a stable approach, maintaining a constant airspeed by adjusting the nose attitude as required. But if that means I'm going to land short, then I add power to extend the aiming point further. The other thing, of course, is that we also, to be stable, we also need to remain aligned up over the centre line of the runway. That introduces our old friend the wind again, that being conscious of how to lay off that drift. Because what we're trying to do is to keep ourself flying down the centre of the runway, and that may mean that you have to come down a little bit sideways.
Some of our airports, in the approach area, there is often a lot of tree lines, and we'll get mechanical turbulence, wind gradient, and a whole bunch of other effects that are going to possibly compromise the stability of our approach. If we've got landing distance available for our aircraft type, we can often extend our aiming point and land further into the airfield where there are better conditions. Clearly this is an option you have to consider, and by doing so you might find that where you would normally land at the threshold, if you just extend that 100 metres, you might find much better conditions to complete the landing. Wind gradient is something we don't actually see and we can't actually detect, and often on our first approach, that's when we first find out where it is and how much it is. But we've got some telltales of when we're likely to expect wind gradient. Wind gradient is something that happens as a result of mechanical mixing or changing of the air, and we see it normally in the lower parts of our approach. It's really important that we actually, through the initial assessment and through the conditions, identify and be ready for it. So one of the key symptoms we see with wind gradient as we approach through it is the aircraft has a sudden loss of airspeed, and also as a result we often sink. It's so tempting for us to pull the stick back at that time, which increases our proximity to the stall. So identifying wind gradient as an environmental factor in any landing approach is really important. If we've managed the approach well, we may have held wing down, or we may have a different crab angle or track to the runway surface direction. It's really important that we have to bring these two things back together as we touch the wheels down in the aircraft. So clearly having a stabilised approach might result in having a track and a heading that are different, but we obviously have to fly the aircraft straight down the runway, aligned with the runway, as we get through the flare and the touchdown.
Well, the landing phase of flight, there's often a lot of factors as well. One of which would be the fatigue of the pilot. So it's at the end of the flight, they think, I'm almost home, and they let their guard down. So that's rule number one. The second one is how well the pilot has managed the energy through the circuit. So have they arrived at the base turn point at the appropriate height, at the appropriate speed to carry out the rest of the circuit, the approach and the landing. Now often if they haven't got that right, that has started a long way before, because they haven't thought about the descent, how much time, how much altitude, how much distance they need to get into the circuit at the correct height, at the correct speed, to then position themselves for the correct base turn point, correct final turn point, and then managing the energy through to landing. The final thing as well is that you see a lot of these accidents occur either during a go-around or because the pilot is reluctant to go around. So the go-around is often a very unpracticed manoeuvre. Once you've got your license, pilots don't really pre-think the go-around, and they've got the push-on-itis that they want to land. And they might go, well, I've made it in from here before, I'll make it in from here again. So they're reluctant to go around because they want to land, they might have family and friends on board, they think that a go around is a bit of a loss of face. Every approach is a potential go around. And practicing the go arounds, pre-thinking the go arounds as well is really, really important.
In the landing phase, we're obviously focused heavily on the aiming point, in order to gain a stabilised approach. Clearly, it's easy to become fixated on that aiming point, but we need to keep our situational awareness open so that we pick up all the other cues and parameters in the landing phase of flight.
In the following scenario, Neil and Paul demonstrate a go-around due to the mismanagement of energy on approach.
So what you're saying, Paul, is you mistook your picture of your profile with your descent rate.
Exactly.
And so you thought, I'll fix that by putting more flap on.
So now I've got into an undershoot situation where I'm falling short of the threshold. So a lot of people will just raise the nose without applying the power, and my speed, because I got flaps on, my speed is going back. So they feel it, and then they'll pull back, and then they'll put a bit of power on to try and save it, and they're going to just, I'm going up now, I'm going down, and this is not really conducive to what I want to do. You should really call it a day here. But apply full power, control the pitch in the yaw, allow the speed. Don't do anything until you have the speed to above the takeoff safety speed. So now I've got the speed, I can control that. I've got a positive rate, I can get rid of the flap in stages over there to a takeoff flap, and that means I can raise my nose to a climb attitude and I can move across.
In the event that the pilot decides on final that he's not going to continue with the approach, then of course you're introducing another area that, apart from the normal distractions, there's a certain amount of tension now, because things have to be suddenly changed and your attention has to go to another level. One of the big problems, of course, in go-round is mistrim, because any aeroplane that's trimmed for final, for landing, will have a trim set in whatever configuration's appropriate for that aeroplane. And the application of full power will inevitably cause a nose-up pitch. And in some aircraft, quite a severe nose-up pitch, where if it's properly trimmed for an approach, so you're virtually hands-off on the approach with the trim set perfectly, if you then apply full power, and you'll need very, very noticeable full forward pressure on the control column just to hold it at a normal climb attitude, otherwise it'll want to pitch right up, certainly to the point where it would stall if you didn't do it, until you get the trim going. If you've got an electric trim, then electric trims by their very nature are slow in their movement. If you've got a mechanical trim with a wheel or some other device, a lever, then you're likely to be able to retrim quickly. But electric trim sometimes takes some time to reach the desired effect. So that's the point. It's power, attitude, trim as usual, but be careful with the power.
In the following example during a flight test, we see how the management of secondary effects and awareness of the stall when under stress can be hard to identify, particularly in transitions from landing to takeoff.
I set off with a student. We were doing a pilot certificate flight test. It was late in the morning and the weather conditions were pretty calm. So we headed off from Bendigo. We generally head out to our training area and we run through several drills. We then headed towards a small grass strip which we use for training. However, this student had never been to that particular grass strip, and that's because of COVID. We had changed some things about what we were doing. It's also because of the weather. The strip had been inaccessible. So for some reason this student had come through without going to that strip. She became really nervous about going to a strip she hadn't been to before. So we have the normal nerves of the flight test, but then we got some extra nerves. And I thought, well, pilot certificate flight test, we should be able to just apply what we do to a new situation. It was very normal for me, so not for her. So we headed out to that strip and our goal was to do a short field landing and short field takeoff. She'd already done steep turns, stalls, precautionary search and landing, so we'd run through quite a lot of different scenarios, and that was one of the remaining tasks to do in the flight test sequence. The landing sequence was pretty good. We were nicely slow, landed fairly well. The power went in full, and I'd say no rudder on, no right rudder, so we just started veering off very quickly to the left. I put in some rudder to stop that, but at the same time, and when I look back, I think, yeah, probably identical timing. We were veering to the left and the nose came up, so there was a bit more pressure on the back stick. So nose came up quite high, and full power though. So we came back to the centre, but hadn't quite straightened up, but we did lift off. We lifted off and then immediately started to veer to the right. Caught the fence, went into the ground, and slow motion, meaning when you're in these sorts of scenarios, you see it happening, but could not do a thing about it. Looking back on that now, I think we'd stalled the plane and we'd wing dropped. So not a sudden big wing drop, but we had no ability to pick it up. Even though full power, we just were too nose high.
When we talk about this startle and surprise, even a pilot who understands how to fix a problem can sometimes mismanage the aircraft in the recovery.
Yeah, look, absolutely. One of the biggest psychological factors with experiencing startle or surprise is the fact that you start to lose the ability to think and you start to react almost on instinct, okay? And the part of our brain called the amygdala that is designed to keep us safe really doesn't have the context as to what to do in these sort of situations. Okay, so pilots will often, they'll freeze on the controls, they'll start making random control inputs. One of the common things we see is pilots will actually pull back, okay? So they can very easily get themselves into a situation where they're now starting to over-control the aircraft, and if they start getting their feet involved as well, that can mean that a wing drop to the left can very quickly turn into a wing drop to the right, which further startles them and surprises them.
Yeah, so it's that second recovery action that can actually cause a bigger problem than the first one in the first place. And we saw that in the video.
Yeah, absolutely. Over-controlling and making random control inputs can really make the situation a lot worse.
I guess another area we see this is in pilot-induced oscillations in the landing, where they've ballooned and the instructor, or they might have been taught, get the nose down. And so that amygdala response, that human response, is to push it forward and then actually drive the nose into the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that situation, pilots, especially if they get surprised, they've flared, they pull back like they think they normally do, the aircraft balloons, their focus very quickly becomes on one thing. Okay, be it the runway, be it what they're doing with the stick, they start to lose their situational awareness as to airspeed and altitude and what the aircraft is doing. So it's not a good situation to be in.
Once you introduce that alarm, that feeling that things are going wrong, then of course the likelihood of error increases exponentially. Yeah, the moment I won't say, I'm trying to avoid saying panic. You're not actually panicking, but you're sort of saying, oh, what's going on here? And your heightened awareness sometimes can actually cause you to overreact.
So obviously, if we get all this right, then we'll get to a successful landing. But the important thing is to be able to make an early decision about when it's not right. And that's why the situational awareness is so important. Clearly, when we are going to make a go-round, we need to realise that the aircraft is configured for a different phase of flight. And so all the things we've talked about, P-forces, slipstream effect, trim position, pitch changes, are all going to come into play. And we have to manage those changes as we move from the landing phase to now the takeoff phase of flight. Clearly, takeoff safety speed is really important to make sure we've got enough airspeed and energy and the correct angle of attack in that missed approach or go round.
I think you're going to understand a stall. We were so close to the ground, like we probably only got 5 foot off the ground really. So I didn't anticipate that being a stall at that point. If we hadn't had the directional challenge, maybe we would have been more clear about what was going on, like why are we veering that way? Whereas it was almost like, well, we've gone off to the left, now we're moving to the right. Is that part of the same movement or is there something else going on? I would not have been able to tell that at the time.
There are a number of things that can contribute to a loss of control after we actually touch the aircraft down. The aircraft's still capable of flying, maybe not supporting all of the weight of the combined occupants in the aircraft, but it still reacts with the air. In this phase of flight, it's critical that we maintain diligence to the approach, maintaining the correct control inputs, recognising the environmental factors, and also recognising the potential onset for a stall, which we often perceive as sink. Many of our accidents are unexplained environmental factors, but some of those can relate to the pilot's handling of the aircraft in that final phase of flight. Clearly, it's easier to relax. It's easier to put the nose wheel down as soon as the aircraft is on the ground. And the aircraft's still basically at flying speed. In a tailwheel aircraft, that becomes incredibly important. We still have to manage the aircraft as it's with an increasing amount of control input with decreasing control response. So the landing's not over, as they say, until it's in the hangar, and that applies to any aircraft, not just tailwheel aircraft. The loss of directional control after touchdown figures highly in our accident statistics. This can be related to control mismanagement and lack of awareness of what the aircraft has still got the capability to fly, and that we need to manage that aircraft right down to the point where it's stopped. Clearly, when we've got conditions in the landing phase of flight where we've got limited control, reducing control effectiveness, any environmental conditions that exist, we're going to have to manage. So knowing what they are, getting a bit of a time assessment, giving yourself time to assess that windsock, having a look at how the conditions are developing and counter those effects with the right control inputs. These are all things that you need to keep in the back of your mind as you get into that final landing phase of flight. In this series, we wanted to have a conversation about loss of control. What are the key elements? Where does it occur? And what can we do as pilots to actually improve our skills, to be aware of it, and also understand ourselves better as human beings about how we will react when we're faced with a loss of control situation. We'd like to thank the pilots, the instructors, our subject matter experts, and the content contributors for helping make this series, and you for watching. Just one positive action by you can make the difference in preventing a serious accident or even saving a life. Thank you.